Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Natalie Bull, Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. Welcome to this webinar, Reconciliation and Heritage, the Need to Transform Heritage Practice. We'll give it a few minutes for people to join the call. And in the meantime, I would encourage everyone to say hello using the chat function there at the bottom of your screen. And let us know where you're participating from today. It's been 7 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the release of those 94 calls to action. But today we're going to talk about what reconciliation really means in practice for the heritage sector, what has changed for us already, and what is still needed to transform our heritage work together on this journey to reconciliation. Since 2016, the National Trust has always opened gatherings like this with a territorial acknowledgement. So that I think that's one way that our practices have changed since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I would normally say that our headquarters are located in Ottawa on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And we know that all of you are participating from different places on lands of other peoples today. And it's important for us to take a moment to acknowledge the culture and the traditions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, past and present, whose presence enriches our shared heritage. But it's easy to say that. Why do we say that, and what does it mean? And when I tell you that I'm actually participating today from New Brunswick on an old family farm from the Loyalist era that is literally on unceded traditional Wolastoqey territory, it makes it so much more personal for me. And so on my journey of reconciliation, I have to reckon with that reality, and it's bringing that territorial acknowledgement home to me in a much more personal way. So I think we'll talk more today about how reconciliation really is personal and how it can play a real part in the work that we do. The next slide, please. So just a word about the National Trust. We're a national charity, and a big part of our role is in empowering the heritage movement with information like we're sharing today. Webinars, gatherings of the sector, our conference, our programs like Launchpad are really all about helping lead and inspire the sector and to be part of transforming it together with our partners. On the next slide, just introducing the people that you see on the screen today. I'm pleased to introduce Lorna Crowshoe, who is the Vice Chair of the National Trust for Canada's Board of Governors, and Miranda Jimmy, who is our key speaker today, and she's the incoming Manager of Reconciliation, Diversity and Inclusion at the National Trust. And myself, I think I've already introduced myself. And off screen, we have Kirsten Vermaki and Holly Boulay, who are here to help field questions and deal with any technical issues that you may have. So feel free to use the chat function to weigh in, add information, but also we have the Q&A that we'll encourage you to use if you have specific questions for Miranda or for Lorna or myself. So Lorna, normally I would also open meetings like this by saying that participants sont encouragés de poser des questions dans la langue de votre choix, and we would always talk about Canada's 2 official languages. But can I ask you to talk about a more inclusive greeting for our session today?
Okay, itabix kanatani, ni stuako kiskanayas tikani, ni date boys from Fiducie. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lorna Crowshoe. I'm from Piikani Nation here in Southern Alberta. I'm calling in from our ancestral territory of the Blackfoot people from Fiducie, also known as High River, Alberta, and from the Treaty 7 community. And I think our languages across the nation are just beautiful. Everybody should be sharing those languages so we can all learn from our traditional places and spaces. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Lorna. And before we turn it over to Miranda, Lorna and I wanted to just share a little bit about the National Trust and our own journey of reconciliation. And I think this webinar is an important piece of the work that the National Trust is doing. And we know that the TRC really touched on all sectors of society, but really in some ways, heritage is a very important player because we know that history and heritage are complex and contentious, and that we've all played a part in sharing a dominant white perspective about history and heritage. So we know that the work we do and the system that we're part of really needs to change. And so that's part of the conversation that we'll be having together today. Lorna, you've been on the board for many years. I think, was it about 2015 or 2016 that you joined the board? And I'd be interested in.
Yeah, 2015.
Yes, an important moment. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your perspective on the trust journey to reconciliation.
Well, I guess, my presence on the National Trust started actually when the Truth and Reconciliation put out their first report. And it was sort of an opportunity for everyone to learn from. And reconciliation is really important to the National Trust. And the Trust has evolved with some of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. But in October, I must say, I'm so proud of this. In October 2016, the National Trust passed a resolution adopting the 10 Truth and Reconciliation principles as an overarching lens for our work, not only to signal its support, but also ensure the National Trust's work will become increasingly relevant for places that matter to First Nations people, Inuit, and Métis people across the country. One of our two main objectives is to engage as many people as possible in the future of Canada's historic places, responding to the imperatives of reconciliation and making space for unrepresented communities and voices. In 2021, the National Trust struck a diversity task force with the mandate to ensure that the Trust is moving forward appropriately in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm happy that Miranda will be speaking about this as her topic in this presentation ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. So the Trust has been working to do our work in a way that is as inclusive as possible, but we obviously have so much more work to do. We've been really blessed with a strong relationship with the Indigenous Heritage Circle, which is an Indigenous designed and led organization that also was founded in 2016 that's dedicated to the advancement of cultural heritage for Indigenous peoples. And if we go to the next slide, the Indigenous Heritage Circle is a partner in the Heritage Reset that many of you may have already heard about. And so the Heritage Reset, I think, is really significant for our work in reconciliation as a sector and for diversity more broadly. And it's really about how we can accelerate the work that we do as a positive force for reconciliation, equity, social justice, and many other important goals. So I'm really excited that Miranda Jimmy is part of the Reset team, and even more excited that she's joining the National Trust as a staff member, which is a concrete way that the National Trust can demonstrate and take action around its commitment to reconciliation and to UNDRIP. So Miranda's work at the Trust will be to lead the transformation of our approach to reconciliation, diversity, and inclusion, and do things like this webinar today, making this kind of information available to the field overall. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the session over to Miranda. Thank you so much in advance, Miranda.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you this morning. I come to you from Amiskwichi-Waskahikan, known to many as Edmonton, in the heart of Treaty 6, homeland to the Métis and the traditional territory of the Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, and later the Métis, and settlers and descendants of settlers from all over the world. Here on the banks, what is currently known as the North Saskatchewan River, Indigenous people have been gathering for time immemorial to share, teach, learn, and celebrate. And I hope it's that same spirit that brings us together virtually this morning. I think when we talk about reconciliation, we need to start with who we are and the understanding that we bring to the world around us. And so with that, I want to introduce you to me a little bit. Starting with baby Miranda. This is a picture I have of my only picture that I have of me as a baby. And if you look really closely, you'll see that I'm wearing a shirt that says, "I'm a little Indian." And this picture encapsulates everything that I know and was taught about what it means to be Indigenous in Canada. It was something I was taught to joke about, to make fun of, to shame myself, as opposed to my Cree identity being a place of purpose and founding and grounding and history and knowledge and tradition. And this is a result of colonization. And before I knew what those words meant, I was experiencing the impacts of colonization on myself and on my family, witnessing the harm that it has caused for me personally. When I was asked to do this presentation, I come to this with many perspectives. I've worked as a heritage practitioner. I've worked in the not-for-profit sector. I've worked for government. I am a citizen of this country. I have both Indigenous and settler roots, and all of that complicates and enlightens me in many different ways. I realized when I was invited to do this presentation on today, March 30th, that today is an important day for me personally. 8 years ago today, I sat in the conference center in downtown Edmonton at the seventh and final national event of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and gave testimony as an intergenerational survivor to the thousands of people that were there. And I look back on what has happened in those 8 years since I gave testimony and the work that has been done, the layers that have been peeled back in telling this truth, and for more Canadians to understand the impact it has had on Indigenous people like me, like my family, like my community, and understand what this means for us going forward in our relationship with each other, with ourselves, and with the land that we call home. And it's with that spirit that I hope that each of you open your heart to this conversation today and do your own personal reflection on what does this mean to you? What does this conversation mean? What does this work mean? And what will the actions going forward mean for the generations to come? So I want to start with the word reconciliation. Um, it's a big word. It has a lot of meanings for different people. Um, many people think of it as a relation to um, Christian or Catholic teachings. And even within the work of truth and reconciliation, it has many meanings. In just the executive summary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, there are 47 different definitions of reconciliation. Um, so there's a couple common ones, specifically when we talk about the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is what was outlined in the settlement agreement as far as the role of the TRC would be. And this is an ongoing individual and collective process. So all of the parties that are involved and are impacted by the Indian residential school system, including the people of Canada, are responsible for reconciliation in an ongoing process. So I think that's a really important way to think about this. This is not about a start and end. It is a constant evolution and responsibility that we have, like I said, to one another and to ourselves. Another definition was provided in that executive summary by the Commission itself. Reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. So it's an ongoing process and it is about that relationship. How do we learn from, relate to, and understand one another in a respectful way? And I think if you go back to the teachings of the peace and friendship treaties and the more formal numbered and crown treaties, that was the spirit and intent as understood by Indigenous people, was that mutual respect for one another. And ultimately, that was the vision that our ancestors had in us living together on this land, is that respect for one another. And I think that that is a seed that we can hold on to and work towards living up to on a day-to-day basis. For me, my definition of reconciliation isn't all these fancy words and sentences. I think about it as the work that we have to do. So if reconciliation is based in truth, as we learn more truth, reconciliation should be changing the way that we do our work. So this is where it becomes an individual responsibility and action. So as we learn more, we should be applying that learning, applying that teaching, applying that truth to the way that we work and the way we understand our work, and transforming it in order to be more respectful, to be more balanced, and to live into that responsibility that the treaties provide us. So reconciliation isn't about doing something new. It's not a checklist that you need to go down. It's not a path to follow necessarily. It's about transforming the work that you do and doing it differently than you did before, because now you know better. So if you apply that belief of reconciliation to your work, every day we have an opportunity to say yes or no to the work of reconciliation in how we work and how we choose to transform our work. I want to share with you a short video for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or maybe need a reminder about what that work was 7 years ago. We'll hear directly from one of the commissioners.
It's important to note that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is unique among all TRCs in the world. We are the first and only one that has ever been created because of the actions of the so-called victims of harms. It was the former students who, when they were children, had no power, no voice to do or say anything about what was happening to them. And for many, many years, their parents didn't either, because the Indian Act had such restrictions in it that their parents were not allowed to take action, in fact were threatened with jail, and some did go to jail if they tried to do anything contrary to the government and church policies about their children being in the schools. But those laws gradually changed. As of 1960, Aboriginal people in Canada finally had the right to vote in Canada and in federal elections. A number of major Indigenous organizations formed, and the voice of individual and collective Indigenous peoples became a force that could not be ignored, and that had a vehicle to get itself before the Canadian courts. And so that's what happened. The individual survivors, as they're called, and then eventually several together in what became a massive class action lawsuit, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, came before the Canadian courts and said what happened to us was not right and we need redress. One of the provisions of a massive out-of-court settlement involving the federal government, 4 national churches, the Catholic entities, several of them, the Anglican Church of Canada, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada, as well as the Assembly of First Nations and the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami. They all, and of course the legal representatives for the survivors themselves, they agreed to this massive out-of-court settlement, and one of the provisions which the survivors themselves fought very hard for was the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They realized that with an out-of-court settlement, they would never have their day in court, as it were, so there would never be a public record of their side of the story of what had happened to them. Meanwhile, the churches over the many decades, the federal government over the many decades, had kept lots of written records and documentation, so that side of the story, the adult side of the story, if I can put it that way, was well documented and available. But the children's side of the story didn't exist. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission then, first and foremost, created a vehicle for those children, now adults, to tell us and teach us the truthful history from their perspective of what had happened to them as little children, what the residential schools had meant to them, their families, and their own subsequent families, and the kind of connective tissue, if I can put it that way, between what happened to them historically and the reality that we see in so much of Canada today about the challenges that are facing so many individuals that we see on the streets of our urban settings, so many of the communities that are living in the absence of some of the basic and fundamental things that are needed, housing, water, and certainly educational outcomes. But also to provide a platform for demonstrating unbelievable courage, unbelievable resilience, the bravery with which people have come forward and spoken from the depths of their heart and sometimes extremely dire experiences, to be able to say today, this is what I have done, this is how I have reclaimed my life, this is how I am reclaiming my life, and this is what I want our country and our world to learn from this experience. It's important to know that the truth.
So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided Canadians with an opportunity to learn from the experience of residential schools from those who lived it. Not only what was documented and what lives on in photographs and documents and information in the archives, but the firsthand knowledge from those who lived it. And I think when we're talking about reconciliation today, this is an opportunity for Canadians to open their eyes to it specifically from a heritage and even understanding history perspective, to say that the documented truth is not only the only truth that exists, and all too often the voices and perspectives of those who lived it are silenced or muted in a way that doesn't pass on the whole truth to future generations. And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a gift to Canadians from survivors to say, this is the truth as we understand it, and we hope that you will take this gift, learn from it, and apply this learning to make sure that future generations experience this place of Canada differently than we did. So the work of the TRC resulted in a 10-volume final report. The executive summary was released in June of 2015, and the subsequent volumes released later that year. Included in this is voices and perspectives of almost 7,000 survivors who chose to give testimony, like myself, to the TRC over its 7-year mandate, as well as a collection of documents and photographs and information that was contained in archives, both public and private, and church records that help to tell a more complete story. Kirsten shared a link to all of these reports. They're available online. This, again, is a gift to Canadians that we can choose to accept and learn from, or we can choose to ignore. And I think that this experience is an opportunity for us to reflect on what we think it means to be Canadian, and understand that our past is not a celebration for everyone, and we need to tell the good and bad parts of who we are in order to understand fully our identity. I challenge you all to read or revisit the full report of the TRC because of the amount of knowledge that's in there. And I find when I read something and maybe go back to it several years later, I understand it and I see it differently. And so if you did have an opportunity in 2015 or in the subsequent years to read the report, now is an opportunity and a reminder to go back and read it again. The most important thing, in my opinion, that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was the calls to action. Included in the executive summary were 94 calls to action, which are specific acts that can be done by Canadians to move the cause of reconciliation forward. When survivors and intergenerational survivors chose to give testimony to the TRC, we had 15 minutes to say whatever we wanted to the commissioners, with an opportunity at the end to provide a concrete example of what is the request to Canadians and to the commission about a solution to this challenge that exists for survivors. And so out of those concrete actions that survivors chose to share with the commission, the commissioners compiled it into the 94 calls to action. These impact every single aspect of Canadian society and are a path forward towards reconciliation. The one challenge that exists in the calls to action is, if you read them, many of them are worded like this. We call on the federal government to blah, blah, blah. Or we call on provincial territorial governments to do this. There is not a specific call to action for individual Canadians. Everything calls on an entity to make changes. And so the challenge in reading it as an individual is to think about your role in this. So if there is a specific call to action to your municipal government or to your federal government, think about it as an individual, that individually each of us make up and are responsible for holding those governments to account. So what is your role in holding those different orders of government to account? What is your role in ensuring that those move forward, that there is adequate funding and resources and plans in place to actually force those actions and society to change? There's also calls to action related to different religious orders, to different public entities, to museums, to archives, to different aspects that we all are connected to in different ways, whether because we are funders of those as taxpayers, or whether we are passionate about particular subjects. We are connected to each one of these calls to action. Again, I encourage you all to revisit this and think about your place and responsibility in these calls to action, and what you have done over the last 7 years since they were released, and what you intend to do in the 7 years to come. So thinking back to 2015 and these calls to action, this was the pathway forward. This was from the mouths of survivors saying, this is how we want to solve this problem. This is how we want to be seen. This is how we want to be included. This is how we want to encourage change in society. So what's actually happened since 2015? Well, it depends on what you, how you define complete. It ranges from 15 or from 5 to 12 actions have been completed. I tend to personally go on the lower end of that, because complete to me means that it has been fully funded, it has been accomplished, it has had impacts, and it continues to have impacts. If you ask the federal government their definition of complete, they might say, well, we put some effort towards it and we've checked it off, as opposed to thinking about that transformation. The examples that I'm going to provide today come from the Yellowhead Institute. Kirsten shared that link in the chat. For a couple years now, they have done accountability updates on where the calls to action have moved in the last few years. So from 2015 to 2019, 8 calls to action were completed according to the Yellowhead Institute. I have a different definition of that, but so number 13, which is about Aboriginal rights, language rights. Call to action 41, which was the inquiry to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This call to action was funded by the federal government in the first budget after the TRC report was released. And the inquiry has now been completed. The inquiry came out with 231 calls for justice. Again, the federal government and the Yellowhead Institute call to action 41 as complete. I would say it's complete when all of those 231 calls to action have been implemented, which the federal government hasn't even started on. Just last year, they released an action plan on how to approach and address those 231, but none have been completed to date. Number 48, these settlement parties adopt and comply with UNDRIP. Again, this is marked as complete, but we know that UNDRIP has not been fully implemented in Canada yet. And many of the other parties, including the churches that signed the settlement agreement, are still struggling to find ways that it connects to and works in their institutions. Number 49, repute European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. This is about, again, in the call to action, this is about a statement saying we don't agree with this, but how is that actually implemented? What does that look like in our legislation, in our approaches, in the way that we govern this country? I feel like that has not been fully implemented either. A National Indian Residential School Student Death Register, number 72. There has been funding provided to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to pull this together. And a couple years ago now, they've released some of their research and continue to research to pull together this list. Number 83, the Canada Council for the Arts, funding for collaboration on reconciliation projects. This is funding to arm's length government agency to provide that work. There isn't long-term sustainable funding for this. Yes, that program exists, but what will it look like going forward? Those are important questions that we need to ask. Number 85, the Alberta Aboriginal Peoples Television Network to provide reconciliation programming. This is putting the work onto the shoulders of Indigenous people to tell our stories on our own platform, which I think is important, but also puts the work on us instead of onto settlers and the broader community. And number 88, support for Indigenous athlete development and support for the North American Indigenous Games. So again, this has been one-time funding that hasn't been agreed to in the long term. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we live with in the society that we have, is that funding generally has to happen within an election term, within a budget term, as opposed to a long-term commitment. So what's happened since 2019? Well, in 2020, there were no calls to action completed. We know that our world changed in 2020 drastically with international pandemic happening, and focus went to different areas, which we understand. We're still in a pandemic, but in June of 2021, reconciliation was back on the federal government and Canadians' radar when the remains of children were identified in Kamloops. And all of a sudden, the federal government was reminded very strongly about their commitments to reconciliation and the calls to action. So in June of 2021, 3 calls to action were completed in that month. The appointment of an Indigenous Language Commissioner, the development of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation was announced in June, and we celebrated the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, 2021. And an update was made to the citizenship oath to include treaties and that responsibility and accountability to Indigenous people as part of your agreement to become a citizen of this country. So those happened fairly quickly because of that public outcry to say, what are we doing next? 2022, so there was all this work in the summer of 2021, and things have gone quiet again. Call to action number 58 is an apology from the Pope for residential schools. That's happening present day right now. Perhaps at this moment, leaders and representatives from the Assembly of First Nations are meeting with Pope Francis. And earlier this week, the Métis National Council and ITK, representing Inuit communities, had an opportunity to speak with the Pope. So this work is happening on a broader level, but I take it back to us individually as Canadians, as treaty people. What are we doing to move the cause of reconciliation forward, to approach reconciliation by taking action that has been asked for us, by us, for us, from Indigenous people to better live into that treaty relationship? So it's important to know that none have been completed related to child welfare, health, or education, which are the largest sections in the 94 calls to action. And as I've mentioned already, there's been no commitment to long-term sustainable funding. So if you think about the reality of where we're at, currently we have a minority federal government, which could fall at any moment. And we could have a change in government. And will our next government be as receptive and as committed to reconciliation? I don't know. And the only way that I do know is if Canadians demand it, request it, and hold that government accountable. So what does that look like for us as individuals? I think that's the challenge, and that's the opportunity that we have every day, as I mentioned. So what does all this mean for the heritage field? So us as individuals, in working in heritage conservation, working in heritage practice, bring ourselves to this conversation, bring our lens and our understanding of the world to our approaches to this work. So in thinking about that as a very individual basis in the way that we understand and relate to the world around us, the connections to the heritage field are our own personal connections to the world and how we approach our work. So we have a responsibility as individuals to understand the perspectives, relate to and empathize and include the perspectives and worldviews of those around us who are impacted by the choices that we make. And if we think about reconciliation as a commitment to that treaty relationship of mutual understanding and respect, how are we showing that respect in our approaches to our work? Whether we are, developers or restorers of historic sites or buildings, or we are programmers in those spaces, or we are volunteers and advocates in the community, how are we showing respect for Indigenous peoples, for that treaty relationship, for the land, and the gifts that survivors have given us in this understanding of their experiences in this place? What are we doing to respect that every single day? And the challenge that we have, both as individuals and as society, is that it's much easier to do things the way that we've always done them, to approach things the way that we know how to do them, the way that makes sense for us. But we need to turn that on its head a little bit and say, what does this mean for the people who are impacted by my decisions? Who is missing from this conversation? How have I made decisions and approached things in a way that actively excludes the most important people in the conversation? And those are difficult conversations to have individually with yourself, with colleagues, with governments, with our partners in the community. But if we're actually committed to the work of reconciliation, we need to have those conversations every day, and we need to change the way that we do our work. That's the only way that we will transform Canada into this place where everyone is included. So what does that actually mean? I can't tell you individually what you need to do. I don't have a checklist for, do A, B, and C, and you will be reconciled and you will be approaching things in a good way, in a respectful way. These are conversations you need to have with yourself, and those personal commitments that you need to make to yourself and those around you in trying to work in a more inclusive, respectful way with Indigenous peoples and perspectives. So here's some tips that I have for you, and I want you to think about what this would actually mean for yourself. And if you want to jot these down, we're gonna have a recording of this presentation. You can come back and revisit it, because I really want you to think about your own personal calls to action. What does this mean for you, and what commitments are you making in your day-to-day, in your annual strategic plans, in your program development, in your relationships, that are going to be acts of reconciliation? So it starts with educating yourself and others. At the root of reconciliation needs to be truth. And every day more truth comes forward. 7 years ago, when the 94 calls to action, the executive summary, and the full 10-volume report was released from the TRC, only a handful of survivors chose to give their stories at that time. Less than 7,000 gave testimony to the TRC, even though there were approximately 80,000 survivors living at the time. So included in the TRC reports is less than 10% of the story. More of the story has continued to come forward in the last 7 years and will continue to come forward as more people are brave enough and honest enough to share that with others, and be honest about their own truth, and be willing to share that with those who want to learn. So educate yourself. Read the TRC report. If you haven't, or it's been a few years, please read it again. It's available in a variety of formats. The full report, as we mentioned, and the link is in the chat, is available for download. You can get it from your local public library. You can get it in audio format. If you Google it on YouTube, the executive summary is read to you in 15-minute chunks from a variety of people, so you can listen to it 15 minutes a day over the next several days. It's available. It is a gift to you to learn from. Take that gift. Familiarize yourself with the calls to action that exist, with that individual responsibility that we have as Canadians to implement them, and find meaningful ways for you to individually and within your organizations and businesses to connect with that work in a meaningful way, and implement them in the ways that make sense for you. Listen to the perspectives of Indigenous peoples. This may seem obvious, and it may seem like something that's already done. There's a difference between consultation and relationship. And I think consultation is often required under federal legislation. There's a duty to consult. But what does that consultation, when does it turn from engagement to relationship? When are you actually listening and learning from Indigenous people as opposed to talking to them? So meet and learn from the Indigenous people in your territory, of whom you are a guest of. You are a guest in their traditional territory, and what does that look like? How are you adopting, learning from, and engaging with their traditions and cultures in the way that you approach your work? Find meaningful ways to elevate and amplify Indigenous voices. So are there ways that you can use your power and privilege in space, because you are a leader in your community and people listen to you and respect what you have to say? How can you step aside and allow Indigenous people to also share that space and be listened to in the same way? This may look like space on your board of directors. It may look like guest speakers coming to events that you host. It may be financial partnerships with neighboring First Nations in the projects that you develop. I don't know what that means for you, but there are many ways that you can include and elevate Indigenous people in the work that you do. Lastly, you need to incorporate what you're learning into your practice. So this is where that, going back to my definition of reconciliation, is doing what you do better than you did it before because you know better now. So what are, how now is that learning, that knowledge, that perspective, that inclusion of Indigenous peoples transforming the way that you work? How can you look back over the last year or 5 years and say, this is how we have changed, this is how I have changed because I am learning? So it starts with understanding your responsibilities under your treaty relationship. If you live in a territory that has a treaty with the Crown and Indigenous peoples, have you read that? What does it look like, and what is your responsibility in your day-to-day practice in being a treaty person and being a descendant of or a beneficiary of that treaty relationship? As mentioned, the National Trust has implemented the Principles for Reconciliation as a path forward. This is a document that the Commission has said these are the 10 ways that you can live into and work within a framework of reconciliation. So implement the Principles for Reconciliation and the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there are 46 articles in UNDRIP that relate to, again, our relationship with and inclusion of Indigenous people. So these are practical ways that you can take your bylaws and documents, governing documents that govern the work that you do, and find ways to include the language and practices of UNDRIP and the Principles of Reconciliation in your work. Ultimately, reconciliation is about a cycle. It is about constantly learning, constantly implementing, constantly transforming and evolving the way that we work to be more respectful. It is not a start and end. If you do these 3 things that I've mentioned here, you're going to learn, you're going to transform, and hopefully you're going to look different than you did before. So once you've done them, repeat. Keep going back, keep learning, keep listening, and keep finding ways to implement. Because every time you learn something, it's going to transform, or it should transform, your approach, your understanding, and the way that you do your work. All of this is difficult. It's challenging. It is going to be hard to think about on a day-to-day basis. But think about the Indigenous people that have been left on the sidelines, whose voices, perspectives, knowledge, and tradition have been excluded for so long, and how difficult that has been. A while back, I heard a former Minister of Indigenous Relations talk about the fact that reconciliation is such a gift. Indigenous people have been excluded for so long and disregarded and marginalized because the dominant society has been decided on by settlers and people from elsewhere. And the fact that reconciliation is still an opportunity on the table, that Indigenous people are still open to any way to be included, is a gift. And I hope that Canadians accept this gift of knowledge, accept this gift of opportunity to learn from and grow and live into this belief of who we are as Canadians, of being welcoming to every culture and tradition. At the end of the TRC, then chair of the TRC, Marie Sinclair, said in presenting the final report, we've laid before you a mountain, we've shown you the way to the top, and we call on Canadians to do the climb. So this is what exists from the mouth of survivors, from the experiences of Indigenous people, but we can't make it happen. He also said, Indigenous people make up 5% of the Canadian population. If any of this is going to change the other 95% have to care and have to do the work. And so as an Indigenous person, as a heritage practitioner, I look to you and say, help me do the work. The executive summary closed with this quote that I want to share with you now. The way we govern ourselves must change. Laws must change. Policies and programs must change. The way we educate our children and ourselves must change. The way we do business must change. Thinking must change. The way we talk to and about each other must change. Well, this is every aspect of Canadian society needs to transform, including the heritage conservation field. So think of us at the bottom of that mountain. The bottom of that mountain looking up to how far we need to go as individuals, as society, as institutions to move up that mountain and to reach that summit where everyone is included and respected in good ways. One of the challenges that we have is standing at the bottom of that mountain and looking up and see how far we need to go and all of the challenges that exist in front of us. And that can be overwhelming. That can be paralyzing. We can be stuck in a place of fear and hesitation and not even sure where to start. But it starts with one step. The way that I like to think about it is this idea of ripples. So each of us can be one drop in the bucket every single day. Attending this webinar today is a drop in the bucket. Going home tonight and talking to your family about what you learned and what you're thinking about is a drop in the bucket. Spending the weekend reading the treaty for the place where you call home, that's a drop in the bucket. So if each of us every single day is one drop in a bucket, one drop in a bucket, one drop in a bucket, each of us is choosing to create a ripple. And when ripples connect with other ripples, they create waves. And over time, waves can change a landscape. Waves can move mountains. So don't lose every opportunity that you have to create a ripple. Even if you think it's small and insignificant, over time, those ripples will force change. So thank you all for your time today. We're going to take an opportunity to listen to some questions. If there's any questions in the chat or any comments from Lorna or Natalie that you want to make. And we have an opportunity now for a few minutes of questions and comments, and then we'll close out.
Thank you so much, Miranda. That was much more than a drop in the bucket for us today. A really wonderful gift. And I think we do have almost 20 minutes for questions. We were planning to go until 1:15. So, and I know there've been a number that have come in. So Kirsten, over to you. I think you're standing by to share those questions, direct them to a panelist.
I am indeed. Thank you everyone for your questions. You can keep putting them into the question and answer box. Questions for Miranda, Natalie, or Lorna as well. First question from Miranda. Do you know of any resources or best practice for engaging Indigenous peoples in cultural heritage planning? This question asker, as a descendant of settlers, what can I do to recognize Indigenous cultural heritage in my work in a respectful and accurate way?
So the fact that you're asking the question is a good start. I think the recognition that there's something missing in your work is a good place to start. And I would go back to that list of questions I said. Start with educating yourselves. Start with connecting to the Indigenous people on the land in which you're situated, and find ways to apply that. I think one of the other most important kind of logistical things is that you need to budget for that work. It's not free and it's not easy. It takes time and it takes money. I get emails, I would say at least a handful a week, people asking me questions and expecting me to do their work for them. The work is about the work that you want to do and the role that it plays in your organization. So what that looks like is you coming up with a plan based on what you know or what you think you need to learn and connecting with the people that know it. I would also defer to Lorna if you had anything to add to that question.
Thanks, Miranda. For me and my work that I do, it's always about education. So I know you've mentioned that twice, but I can't speak enough about educating groups that you're working with. I'm doing some work right now on climate change, and a difficult conversation that always sort of is present is our Indigenous worldview. And that's a starting place for me. If we can understand Indigenous worldview on climate change and present that, but it takes time. It's really baby steps. So not in I guess, a disrespectful way, but I always say, let's educate ourselves first. So that would be my response. Thanks, Miranda.
Excellent. Thanks, ladies. Next question from Jenny Wilson, who's asked a couple actually. She says, hello, Miranda, very powerful words. Thank you for sharing with us today. Other than the commission report and CTA, do you have a reading list you can share for us? Books, essays, how about podcasts?
Oh, that's a great segue, Kirsten, to what you just posted in the chat. Just in the last few weeks, I've been working with the National Trust. We've created a resource list that's posted on the website. That's a good starting point, specifically as it relates to the heritage sector. So have a look at that. There are tons of reading lists out there. Literally put into Google reconciliation reading lists and you'll come up with a handful from the federal government, Indigenous relations, to CBC Books has put them out. Your local library might have resources as well. There's not a shortage of information. There's a shortage of time to take it all in. Again, I would flip that back to you and say to do your own research based on recognizing your own knowledge gaps and where it is that you need to learn from.
And thanks. And I've put into the chat links to the National Trust website and the resource list that Miranda just mentioned as well. Another question, and this one is about land acknowledgement, which I think brings up an interesting point that Natalie started with today. Jane is saying, I organize Jane's walks, many of which are heritage focused, i.e. settler focused. Is it enough to offer an Indigenous land acknowledgement at the beginning of a walk, or to note the basic info on the original inhabitants of an area? I have reached out several times to local Indigenous groups to invite involvement, but I never hear back, unfortunately. Do you have any other suggestions?
So I think for me, there's two parts to that question. One is the act of acknowledging land or acknowledging the treaty in which you are party to is only one part of the equation. The other part is, how are you living into that? How are you showing the ways in which that treaty relates to the work that you're doing, is an active participant in your approach to the work? So I would say land acknowledgements have come kind of commonplace in the last 5 years. You're almost expected at the beginning of any event in the public. But my challenge is, what does that look like in how you're approaching the knowledge that's being shared at that event? Who are the participants that are being passed a microphone? What is the knowledge that's being shared, and is there a balance of that treaty relationship in the work and the approach that you're doing? If there isn't, because you're, as mentioned, the second part of that is you've reached out to Indigenous people to be involved and don't get a response, I would go back to the work that needs to be done to build relationships. So if you are only reaching out when you need something, that's not a relationship. That is a transaction. And in order for a transaction to take place, even if it is a transaction, it has to be mutually beneficial. So if you're reaching out because you need something, my first question would be, what are you offering in return for that? And the second part is, what are you doing in all the other time in between when you need something to build relationships with those people? So this is where I go back to reconciliation, and this work is not, it's not easy and it's not quick, and it takes resources, it takes time and money, and it has to be intentional every single day, not just when you've got a box to check on the work that you're doing. Lorna, did you have anything to add to that?
That's a great response, Miranda. The only other thing I would add is it's confusing sometimes to do land acknowledgements. I work with land acknowledgements consistently. And when we go back to the basics of land acknowledgements, it's really about tribes or nations welcoming people to their traditional territory. That's sort of the basic steps. Is it's about welcoming people to the traditional territory. Sometimes they get a little political. That's certainly not why they're established. So if you think of them about relationships generally between tribes, good relationships between tribes. So that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Natalie, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to this, having just done an acknowledgement today.
Well, as I said, for me, making it more personal, making sure that it feels personal, I think is much more important than just reading something off the page as a gesture.
Yes.
And I think that leads to a question we had about one of your slides, Miranda, when you're talking about connections to the heritage field. You use the term guest. So when you're saying listen to the perspectives of Indigenous peoples, you say meet with them and learn from the Indigenous peoples of whom you are a guest. And I think someone's asking for a little bit of expansion on what you mean by that.
Lorna, I'm curious if you want to take this.
Well, I guess from a settler perspective, and within the context of treaties, everyone that comes into your territory is a guest, and so you acknowledge that, and that's the starting point, that you're on some nation's traditional territory, and it's just acknowledging that you're on these traditional lands. And I think what one step further is understanding how Indigenous nations became displaced from their traditional lands and now live on reserve lands. I'm from the Blackfoot community. My reserve lands are at Piikani Nation. And I always reference that those are that's my home. But when I work and I live in the Calgary area, I'm in Mohkinstsis. These are the traditional lands of my of the Blackfoot people, the ancestral lands of the Blackfoot people. But we also know that we are in shared territory. What does that shared territory mean? So underneath land acknowledgements, we have to really consider that Indigenous people were displaced, but their ancestors still are from the traditional territory, and that we still have a relationship with our ancestors. And I actually heard it within the context of climate change in another presentation I was listening into earlier this week. And it's about not only your ancestors, but also your ancestors of the animals and the ancestors of your plants and herbs and those things that you still utilize for your cultural and traditional well-being. So we can even go further to explore underneath the surface of land acknowledgements and what it means to the people of the territory. So in a long version, that's sort of my response. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the word guest is really important because it underlines challenges that narrative that Canada was this empty place and Europeans discovered it and there was nothing here before. And so the first European person to show up all of a sudden claims the territory. And so when you look at it from an Indigenous worldview, everyone who is not Indigenous were newcomers to this territory, were newcomers to this land. But through the acts of colonization and settler colonialism, took over and moved in and decided new rules for this place. And so by placing the label on yourself as being a guest, puts a little bit of that history into a different perspective and forces you to be a little bit more humble about the place that you actually hold. So if you are a guest in someone's home, you maybe act differently than if you're the owner of that place. And so putting that framework of guest maybe will just think about and force you to think about your work in a slightly different way than you do right now.
That's great.
Kirsten, were
Thank
there
you very
any
much.
other questions?
There are so many. I'm trying to sort of spread it around. I think this is a great question that a lot of us might be wondering. Jenny's also asking, to bring it back to the work of heritage organizations. Are there any organizations or groups that you see at an advanced stage of transforming their work in this way? Are there any role models for reconciliation?
For me personally, I try not to highlight one person as doing it right because there are so many ways that it can be done right or better than it's being done. I also don't want to ever put anyone in the position of the Reconciliation Olympics where there's gold medals being handed out for excellence, because everyone has an opportunity to move things forward in their own way. And it looks differently organization to organization. But I would point to the work of the Indigenous Heritage Circle, specifically Indigenous led organization that's developed because of heritage practitioners working in the field saying, here are the gaps that we've identified and here are ways that we can gather together and work better to meet our needs. And then find ways to use that power and voice to influence the work of others in the sector. So it's not necessarily about everyone getting a gold medal, it's about recognizing the gaps and working in ways that fill those gaps for the betterment of everyone. I don't know, Lorna, if you have any examples that you wanted to share.
Well, I just want to say that I've been sort of listening to the Indigenous Heritage Circle for quite some time. I think they started out in 2013. And I must say that their process has been very engaging with with Indigenous nations across Canada. So they've touched base with the Assembly of First Nations, with the Métis community, with the Inuit community. So they're really grounded in consulting and engaging with those communities. So bringing their work forward is really important because of how they've engaged and the voices heard at their table. So when they come forward and say, this is sort of what we represent, then on the Indigenous community side, I'd say they were very well represented on the heritage front. So their journey forward, their vision forward is really embedded in the Indigenous community across this country. So that's all I wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Natalie, did you have any examples that you wanted to share?
Well, I don't want to single any organization out, but and I think my internet is also unstable, but I think, I mean, at our conference, we invite organizations to come share the work that they're doing. And I think we're on a journey together, and each organization has different ways that they can reflect reconciliation in their work.
Great. I think we have time for one more question.
All right, this is really drilling down on policy. So this is a question I think a lot of people are wondering. Denise is asking, each person and organization have a role to play in reconciliation. What policy changes do you think need to happen in the field of heritage policy at federal or provincial levels? What is the most urgent one, in your opinion?
Natalie, I'll start with you.
I think it's funding. It's funding to support the work of Indigenous organizations, Indigenous peoples to do their own work of protecting, safeguarding, interpreting the places that matter to them.
Lorna?
Well, I think utilizing the UNDRIP principles. I mean, you talked about the platform of calls to action and the platform of truth and reconciliation principles. I think that's a starting point. Whatever works for your organization is really important. But yesterday, as I was reviewing the TRC principles, one certainly came to mind, and that's supporting Aboriginal peoples' cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation processes are essential. And I think that's certainly one principle that the heritage community can, well, to review and consider in their work. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with Natalie and Lorna. Funding is needed. You know, referring to the principles and the documents that are already in place. You know, we're 20 plus years since the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We've got the TRC calls to action. We've got the calls for justice from the inquiry. We've got the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The answer is there. The answer for policy and what needs to be done are in all of those documents that Indigenous people have put together and gifted to the world to say, this is what needs to be done. What needs to be done is to do it. Like, there's no other way to put it, is the answers have been laid before us, and we just need to figure out how we're going to make it happen. And so individually, like I said, we have an opportunity to implement those into our practice. We have ways to integrate it into our policies and bylaws of our organizations we work with and for. And we have an opportunity to advocate for that to be implemented into legislation in our country. And, you know, Julie's made a comment in the Q&A about moving UNDRIP forward in Canada. Yes, it needs to happen. It needs to be done. And the longer we wait, the more challenge it's going to be to implement, because we're going to be 20 years down the line again, and another report's going to be released, and we're going to be saying the same things over and over again. So now is the opportunity. Thank you all so much for your perspectives and for joining us today, and for making time, because this is a drop in the bucket, an hour out of your work day to listen to this conversation and hopefully spark some reflection. I think those are all good steps forward. The next step is the action piece. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie.
Great. I just want to say thank you so much. I think everyone on the call today, and there were almost 200 people participating. A big thank you to you, Miranda, Jimmy, and to Lorna Croshu for sharing your insights today. Thanks to Kirsten Vermaki and Holly Boulay for being there in the background, fielding questions and making sure it all runs smoothly. I think it's really about doing it differently every day, as Miranda told us, and to build those real relationships and to make it personal. So Lorna read from one of the 10 Truth and Reconciliation Principles, number 8. And also I think number 9 really resonates for us as well at the Trust. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. So those are some guiding principles that we look at as we do our work. We're so excited to be working with Miranda and Jimmy going forward, and I think you'll all be seeing more of Miranda. We're looking forward to her help in transforming the work of the National Trust. You'll be receiving a follow-up email. On the screen, you'll see information about ways you can tap into other National Trust resources. Shout out to our Year of Learning, which is a new member benefit. And we're offering a special rate for joining if you're not already a member of the National Trust, a way for you to tap into resources like this one year round. Just to mention too about our next webinar coming up on April 13th on heritage real estate and economics. So thank you so much, everyone. This has been a wonderful gift and an important drop in the bucket for all of us participating today. Thank you so much. À la prochaine.
Bye.